Blood is thicker than water, but greed turns it toxic. I spent 10 years building a multi-million-dollar company from the dirt of our parents' ruined estate. My sister wanted it all, and she almost won. Until a quiet courtroom bailiff cleared his throat and completely destroyed her life. If you want to understand how a family tears itself apart, you have to look at the foundation. Ours was built on 50 acres of prime, sprawling Connecticut land called Oakwell. When we were children, Oakwell was a paradise of ancient oak trees, overgrown gardens, and a crumbling Victorian house that my parents, Arthur and Eleanor Harrison, stubbornly refused to sell. But dirt doesn't pay the mortgage. When my father passed away from a sudden heart attack when I was 22, the reality of Oakwell came crashing down on my mother, my older sister Beatrice, and me. We were drowning in debt. The property was heavily mortgaged, the taxes were in arrears, and the house was literally rotting from the inside out. Beatrice, who had always preferred the glittering lights of Manhattan and the comfort of other people's bank accounts, took one look at the estate's balance sheet and packed her bags. "I can't bury my 20s in this graveyard, Gabrielle," Beatrice told me. Standing in the foyer, with 2 designer suitcases our father had bought her for a graduation she barely passed. "Sell the place. Let the bank take it. Mom can come live in a condo somewhere." But Mom refused to leave, and I refused to let her lose the only home she had ever loved. So, while Beatrice moved to Europe on a soul-searching trip funded by her wealthy new fiancé, I stayed behind. I rolled up my sleeves, buried my hands in the Connecticut soil, and got to work. I took out a massive personal loan. I learned plumbing, basic carpentry, and horticulture. I started growing rare organic orchids and specialized landscaping plants in the dilapidated greenhouses out back. Over the next decade, through sweat, tears, and a terrifying amount of debt, I transformed Oakwell. I didn't just save the house. I built Oakwell Designs, a boutique landscaping and organic floral supply company. By the time I was 32, Oakwell Designs was servicing high-end corporate clients across the East Coast. We were pulling in 8 figures a year. My mother lived long enough to see Oakwell thrive again. When she passed away peacefully in her sleep, she left the entirety of the Oakwell property to both Beatrice and me, split 50/50. It was fair. It was what she always wanted. What she didn't leave Beatrice was my company. Oakwell Designs was an LLC, completely separate from the estate, funded by my own loans, built by my own hands, and registered solely under my name. I assumed Beatrice would simply want me to buy out her half of the physical property so she could take her cash and go back to her luxury lifestyle in Paris. I was dead wrong. The nightmare began on a Tuesday morning, exactly 4 months after Mom's funeral. I was in the greenhouse, finalizing a massive contract for a tech billionaire's new compound, when a black town car pulled up the gravel driveway. A man in a sharp gray suit stepped out, walked right past my employees only sign, and handed me a thick manila envelope. "Gabrielle Harrison? You've been served." I wiped the soil from my hands, tore open the envelope, and felt the blood drain from my face. It was a lawsuit. Beatrice wasn't suing for half the house. She was suing for total control of the property and 80% ownership of Oakwell Designs. According to the legal filing, Beatrice claimed that the initial seed money I used to start the business came from a hidden joint family trust, making her a silent, majority partner. Furthermore, the lawsuit contained a shocking attachment, a signed, notarized contract, supposedly dated a week before my mother's death, transferring all commercial rights of the Oakwell land exclusively to Beatrice, citing me as merely a hired manager. I called my lawyer, Simon Caldwell, my hands shaking so hard I dropped the phone twice. "Simon," I choked out when he answered, "she's trying to take the business. She has a document. She says Mom signed it." "Send it to me right now," Simon said, his tone instantly shifting from friendly to clinical. An hour later, I was sitting in Simon's office. He laid the document flat on his mahogany desk. The signature at the bottom was undeniably my mother's. The swooping E and the sharp H of Eleanor Harrison were unmistakable. The notary seal belonged to a man named Gregory Finch, someone I had never heard of. Gabrielle, if this document holds up in court, Simon warned, rubbing his temples. Beatrice doesn't just get the company. She can sue you for 10 years of back pay for mismanaging her assets. She will bankrupt you, take the house, and leave you with nothing. But it's a lie, I screamed, slamming my hands on the desk. Mom would never sign this. She couldn't even hold a pen her last 2 weeks. She had advanced Parkinson's, Simon. Her hands shook violently. Look at that signature, it's perfect. It's too perfect. Simon sighed. Proving a forgery against a notarized document is incredibly difficult, Gabrielle. Beatrice has retained Richard Sterling. I felt a cold pit form in my stomach. Richard Sterling wasn't just a lawyer. He was a shark in a three-piece suit. He was notorious for destroying lives in court, burying opponents in endless paperwork, and twisting facts until juries were dizzy. Beatrice had hired a mercenary. For the next 8 months, my life was a living hell. Depositions, discovery, endless requests for 10 years of financial records. Beatrice refused to speak to me directly. Whenever I saw her across a conference table, she sat there with a cold, smug smile, wearing clothes bought with her husband's money, acting like she was the aggrieved party. She wanted to erase my 10 years of grueling labor and claim the empire for herself. And as we finally approached the trial date, the terrifying reality set in. With Sterling at the helm, she was probably going to win. Judge Patricia Miller's courtroom smelled of floor wax, old wood, and impending doom. It was a brisk November morning when the trial finally began. I sat beside Simon at the defendant's table, feeling completely nauseous. I wore a conservative navy suit, but I felt exposed, stripped down to my nerves. Across the aisle, Beatrice looked like she belonged on the cover of a grieving widow's magazine. She wore a tailored black dress, minimal makeup to make herself look pale and tired, and occasionally dabbed at dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. Richard Sterling sat next to her, arranging his files with predatory precision. Standing near the jury box was the courtroom bailiff. His name tag read Officer Thomas Gable. He was an older man, late 50s, with graying hair neatly parted, heavy-lidded eyes, and a quiet, unassuming demeanor. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the room with the detached boredom of a man who had seen 1,000 families tear each other apart over money. I had no idea how important he was about to become. Judge Miller, a strict, no-nonsense woman with sharp features, banged her gavel. Court is in session. Mr. Sterling, your opening statement. Sterling stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the jury box. Ladies and gentlemen, Sterling began, his voice smooth and dripping with fabricated empathy. This is a case about a stolen legacy. You will hear the tragic story of Beatrice Harrison, a loving daughter who trusted her younger sister, Gabrielle, to manage their aging mother's affairs. Beatrice stepped away to start a family, trusting Gabrielle to keep the Oakwell estate afloat. Instead, Gabrielle used the estate as her personal piggy bank. I dug my fingernails into my palms until they bled. Gabrielle Harrison secretly drained family trusts to build a company, Sterling continued, pointing a dramatic finger at me. And when their beloved mother, Eleanor, realized what Gabrielle was doing, she tried to protect her eldest daughter. She signed a legally binding addendum, notarized and witnessed, granting commercial control of Oakwell back to Beatrice. But Gabrielle hid it. Gabrielle locked her sister out. Today, we are simply asking for what is rightfully Beatrice's. It was a masterclass in fiction. Simon delivered our opening statement, focusing on the facts, the sweat equity, and the medical records detailing our mother's Parkinson's, but I could tell the jury was already captivated by Sterling's dramatic narrative. Then came the first ambush. Sterling called Beatrice to the stand. She played the victim flawlessly. Her voice trembled at the exact right moments. She spoke of how much she missed our mother, how she had begged me to let her help with the estate, but I had shut her out. "And Miss Harrison," Sterling said gently, handing her the forged contract. "Can you tell the court what this is?" It's the document my mother gave me," Beatrice whispered, a single tear finally escaping her eye. She called me to the house quietly when Gabrielle was away. She was terrified of Gabrielle. She said Gabrielle was taking everything. She handed me this, already notarized, to ensure I wouldn't be left with nothing. Objection, Simon shouted, jumping up. Hearsay, Your Honor. The mother is deceased and cannot corroborate this conversation. Sustained, Judge Miller snapped. The jury will disregard the mother's alleged statements. But the damage was done. The jury had heard it. They looked at me with open disgust. Sterling then submitted the original, physical document into Evidence Exhibit C. Officer Gable, the bailiff, walked over to Sterling, took the document in his gloved hands, and walked it up to the judge's bench. As Gable carried it, he stopped for just a fraction of a second. Of course, he looked down at the paper. He tilted it slightly, catching the overhead fluorescent light. A tiny frown creased his forehead. He handed it to the judge, stepped back to his post, and folded his arms. I didn't think anything of it at the time. My world was collapsing too fast. Your Honor, Sterling said, smiling like a predator who smelled blood in the water. The defense has claimed this signature is forged because Eleanor Harrison had advanced Parkinson's. However, we have a surprise witness. Simon shot up. Objection. We were not notified of any such witness in discovery. The witness only came forward last night, Your Honor, Sterling replied smoothly. He felt a moral obligation to the truth. I'll allow it, Judge Miller ruled, scowling. But tread lightly, Mr. Sterling. The courtroom doors opened, and my heart stopped. Walking down the aisle was David Arris. He was our parents' old accountant, a man I had known since I was a child. I had fired David 5 years ago, when I found out he had been quietly embezzling small amounts from Oakwell Designs to feed a gambling habit. I never pressed charges because of his history with my dad, but I kicked him off the property forever. Beatrice had found him. Beatrice had paid him off. David took the stand, refusing to look me in the eye. Mr. Arris, Sterling asked, were you present at Oakwell on September 12th, the date on Exhibit C? I was, David lied, his voice steady. Eleanor called me over. She was having a good day with her illness. Her hands were steady. I watched her sign the document herself, and then I watched the notary stamp it. The courtroom buzzed. Simon looked at me, his face pale. We were dead. If a neutral third party testified to seeing the physical signing, the medical records didn't matter. Sterling turned to me, a smug, victorious grin plastered across his face. Beatrice wasn't even pretending to cry anymore. She was staring at me, her eyes gleaming with absolute triumph. She had beaten me. She had stolen my life, my 10 years of blood and dirt, and she was going to get away with it. I buried my face in my hands, trying not to break down in front of the jury. It was over. Does the defense wish to cross-examine? Judge Miller asked, her voice sounding millions of miles away. Simon stood up slowly, clearly scrambling for a thread to pull. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Arris, you expect this court to believe. Excuse me, Your Honor. The voice didn't come from Simon. It didn't come from Sterling or the witness stand. It came from the side of the room. Everyone, the judge, the lawyers, the jury, Beatrice, and I, whipped our heads around. Officer Thomas Gable, the quiet bailiff who had been leaning against the wall for 2 days, stepped forward. He cleared his throat, adjusting his duty belt. Bailiff? Judge Miller asked, clearly stunned. What is the meaning of this interruption? Gable looked directly at Beatrice, then at Sterling, and finally at the judge. Your Honor, with all due respect to the court, Gable said, his voice deep and remarkably calm, that document is a fake, and I can prove it right now. For a moment, the courtroom was so silent you could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock above the jury box. No one breathed. The air itself seemed to have frozen solid. Judge Patricia Miller lowered her pen, her sharp eyes fixing on the bailiff. Officer Gable, she said, her voice dropping an octave, carrying a dangerous, razor-edge warning. You are an officer of this court, but you are not counsel, and you are certainly not a witness. You are entirely out of line. Objection, Your Honor. Richard Sterling barked, finally shaking on shock. He practically threw himself over the plaintiff's table. This is an unprecedented breach of protocol. I demand a mistrial. This bailiff is tampering with the jury. Sit down, Mr. Sterling, Judge Miller snapped, her gaze never leaving the bailiff. Officer Gable. I suggest you have an extraordinary explanation for interrupting my proceedings, or you will be looking at a contempt charge and the immediate loss of your pension. Thomas Gable didn't flinch. He didn't sweat. He simply walked toward the center of the room, unhooking his thumbs from his belt. Your Honor, I apologize for the breach in protocol, Gable said, his tone incredibly steady, almost conversational. But before I took this quiet post to ride out my retirement, I spent 28 years as a lead investigator for the state police's white-collar crime and fraud division. I've examined thousands of forged documents, and the one sitting on your desk right now is a glaring, amateur-hour fake. Sterling turned purple. This is outrageous. He has no standing. He hasn't been qualified as an expert witness. I don't need to be an expert witness to read, Counselor, Gable replied calmly, turning to face Sterling. And neither does the judge. Gable looked back up at the bench. Your Honor, earlier, when I handed you Exhibit C, the alleged contract transferring Oakwell to Beatrice Harrison, I held it up. The courtroom's fluorescent lights caught the paper. I saw the watermark. I thought I recognized it, but I needed a minute to pull up my old department files on my phone to be absolutely sure. I am sure. Simon Caldwell, my lawyer, slowly rose to his feet, his voice hushed but desperate. If the bailiff has observed a physical impossibility regarding a piece of entered evidence, the court has a duty to examine it. Judge Miller looked at Simon, then at Sterling, who was practically hyperventilating, and finally at Beatrice. Beatrice's pristine, grieving widow mask had slipped entirely. Her face was chalk white. Her manicured hands were gripping the edge of the wooden table so hard her knuckles were yellow. Approach the bench, Officer Gable, Judge Miller commanded. Gable walked up the wooden steps. Hold the document up to the light, Your Honor. The top left corner. Judge Miller picked up the thick, cream-colored paper. It was the linchpin of Beatrice's entire case. The document that supposedly stripped away my 10 years of blood, sweat, and tears. Judge Miller held it up against the harsh glare of the ceiling lights. A heavy, suffocating silence descended on the room once more. I could hear my own pulse thumping in my ears. Beside me, Simon wasn't breathing. Judge Miller lowered the paper. She looked at it flat on her desk. Then, she held it up to the light a second time, her eyes narrowing into cold, furious slits. Officer Gable, Judge Miller said, her voice suddenly stripped of any annoyance, replaced by a terrifying judicial calm. For the record, what is the watermark embedded in this paper? It is the corporate crest of the Hawthorne Paper Mill, Your Honor, Gable recited smoothly. Specifically, their archival premium line. Beneath the crest, there is a small, 4-digit security code. It reads HP24. And what does HP24 signify? Judge Miller asked. Hawthorne Paper changes their security watermarks every 2 years to prevent corporate fraud, Gable explained, turning slightly so the jury could hear his booming, authoritative voice. The HP24 watermark was first manufactured and released to commercial suppliers exactly 11 months ago. I know this because my former department issued a bulletin on it. I felt the oxygen rush back into my lungs in a dizzying wave. Gable turned and pointed a heavy, weathered finger directly at Beatrice. The date written on that contract is September 12th, 3 years ago. Eleanor Harrison passed away 3 years ago. But that piece of paper, Your Honor, didn't exist until last year. The courtroom erupted. It was a visceral explosion of noise. 3 of the jurors literally gasped out loud. Simon slammed his hand down on our table, letting out a sharp, breathless laugh of pure disbelief. I covered my mouth with both hands, hot tears of overwhelming relief streaming down my face. My mother hadn't betrayed me. I had always known it in my heart, but hearing it proven, hearing the absolute, undeniable science of it, broke something open inside me. Order! Order in this court! Judge Miller roared, slamming her gavel down with such force I thought the wooden handle might splinter. Silence, or I will clear this gallery, The noise died down to a frantic, buzzing murmur. Richard Sterling looked like he had been shot. The arrogant, slick predator was gone. He was staring at the paper in the judge's hand as if it were a venomous snake. As a veteran lawyer, he knew exactly what this meant. He hadn't just lost a case. He had presented fabricated evidence to a federal judge. His law license, his career, and his freedom were suddenly dangling over a roaring fire. And then, Judge Miller slowly turned her terrifying gaze toward the witness stand. David Arris, the accountant Beatrice had bribed, was still sitting there. He looked like a man who had just stepped onto a landmine and heard the click. "Mr. Arris," Judge Miller said softly. It was the quietest she had spoken all day, and it was the most frightening sound I had ever heard. "You just sat in my courtroom, placed your hand on a Bible, and swore under penalty of perjury that you physically watched Eleanor Harrison sign this exact piece of paper 3 years ago." David's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He swallowed audibly, a bead of sweat tracing down his temple. I... Before you say another word, Mr. Arris, you need to understand your current reality." Judge Miller leaned forward, her eyes locked onto him like laser beams. "Perjury in a civil suit of this magnitude carries a maximum sentence of 5 years in state prison. Conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and extortion will add another 10 to 15. I am going to have the district attorney's office down here in 5 minutes. If you lie to me again, you will not see the outside of a cell until you are a very old man." David began to shake. Physically, violently shake. "Now," Judge Miller whispered, "did you see Eleanor Harrison sign this piece of paper?" "No!" David practically screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched sob. He threw his hands up, instantly folding under the unbearable weight of the judge's threat. "No, I didn't see her sign it. I never saw her sign anything." "David, shut your mouth," Beatrice shrieked, jumping up from her chair. The sweet, grieving daughter was completely gone. Her face was twisted in a mask of pure, ugly rage. "Don't you say another word, you pathetic little coward. Miss Harrison, sit down and remain silent, or I will have you gagged." Judge Miller bellowed, pointing her gavel at my sister like a weapon. "Mr. Arris, continue." David pointed a trembling finger directly at Beatrice. "She paid me. She came to me 2 months ago. She said she had found a notary stamp at an estate sale and figured out how to fake her mother's handwriting. She just needed a witness. She said Gabrielle stole the company from her, and she was just taking back what was hers. She paid me $50,000 in cash to get on this stand and lie." "He's lying. He's a disgruntled ex-employee," Beatrice screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the mahogany walls. "Gabrielle paid him to say this. Gabrielle is setting me up." But the jury wasn't looking at me. They were looking at Beatrice with absolute disgust. The illusion was shattered. The mask had fallen, revealing the desperate, greedy monster underneath. Richard Sterling didn't waste a single second. The instinct for self-preservation in a high-powered attorney is a terrifying thing to witness. He furiously shoved his files into his leather briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut with a sharp clack. "Your Honor," Sterling said, his voice loud and artificially steady, projecting to the entire room to ensure his innocence was on the record. "I am absolutely appalled. I had absolutely zero knowledge of this forgery. I was presented with this document by my client, who assured me of its absolute authenticity. I have been deceived, and this court has been deceived." "You coward!" Beatrice hissed at him, grabbing his arm. "You told me we would win. You told me it was foolproof." Sterling violently yanked his arm out of her grasp as if she were diseased. "Your Honor, effective immediately, I formally request to withdraw as counsel for the plaintiff due to an irreconcilable breach of ethics and criminal deceit by my client." "Granted," Judge Miller said, her lip curling in disgust. "Mr. Sterling, you will remain in the building. The Ethics Board and the police will want a full statement regarding your vetting of this evidence." "Understood, Your Honor." Sterling took 3 large steps away from Beatrice's table, physically distancing himself from the sinking ship. Beatrice was now completely isolated. She spun around wildly, her eyes scanning the gallery behind her. "Preston!" she yelled, looking at the second row. Her husband, Preston, a wealthy investment banker who had bankrolled this entire legal assault, was sitting stiffly on the wooden bench. He was staring at Beatrice, but not with love or support. He was looking at her with a terrifying, cold calculation. He was a man who managed risk for a living, and his wife had just become the ultimate liability. "Preston, do something!" Beatrice demanded, her voice bordering on hysterical. "Call the firm. Get the senior partners down here. They can't do this to me." Preston didn't say a word. He slowly stood up, buttoned his bespoke suit jacket, and picked up his cashmere overcoat. "Preston?" Beatrice's voice dropped to a terrified whisper. He didn't even look at her. Preston turned on his heel, walked up the center aisle of the courtroom, pushed open the heavy double oak doors, and walked out. He didn't look back. In that single, silent action, he abandoned her to the wolves. He was already mentally calculating the cost of the divorce lawyers he was going to call from the parking lot. Beatrice watched the doors swing shut, her mouth hanging open in stunned silence. The reality of her situation finally crashed down on her. She had no lawyer, she had no husband, she had no money of her own, and she had just committed a massive felony in front of a federal judge. "Bailiff Gable," Judge Miller said, her voice cutting through the heavy air. "Yes, Your Honor?" Gable replied, stepping forward. "Please take Mr. Aris and Miss Harrison into custody," Judge Miller ordered, her gavel coming down with a final, echoing bang. "They are to be held in the courthouse holding cells, pending the arrival of the district attorney. We are adjourned." "With pleasure, Judge." I sat frozen at my table, watching as Thomas Gable calmly pulled a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. He walked over to David Aris first. David didn't fight. He just hung his head and offered his wrists, crying softly. Then, Gable walked over to Beatrice. My sister, who had spent her entire life manipulating everyone around her, who had sneered at my calloused hands, who had tried to steal the company I built from the dirt. She backed away from the bailiff, her eyes wide with terror. "No," Beatrice whispered, shaking her head. "No, you can't do this. I'm Beatrice Harrison. You can't put those on me." "Turn around, ma'am, and put your hands behind your back," Gable said, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "Gabrielle!" Beatrice suddenly screamed, lunging toward my table. "Gabrielle! Tell them! Tell them it's a misunderstanding. We're sisters, Gabrielle. Please." I looked at her. I looked at the woman who had happily tried to bankrupt me, who had dragged our mother's name through the mud, who had fabricated lies to destroy my life. I felt a profound, heavy sadness for what our family had become, but I felt absolutely no pity for her. I stood up, smoothed down the front of my suit, and looked her dead in the eye. "You burned this bridge to the ground, Beatrice," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Now you get to live in the ashes." Gable grabbed her arm, spun her around, and the sharp click-clack of the handcuffs locking into place echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. The heavy oak doors of Judge Miller's courtroom swung shut, sealing Beatrice's fate. As the sharp, metallic echo of her handcuffs faded down the corridor, the crushing weight that had sat on my chest for 8 agonizing months finally lifted. I collapsed back into my heavy wooden chair, buried my face in my hands, and let out a long, ragged breath. Beside me, Simon Caldwell let out a low whistle, slowly packing his legal pads into his leather briefcase. We had walked into that room preparing for a slaughter, and we walked out witnessing a self-inflicted execution. The fallout was swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. Within 48 hours, the district attorney officially charged Beatrice Harrison and David Aris with felony forgery, perjury, extortion, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Because Beatrice had attempted to use the forged document to steal a multi-million-dollar company across state lines. Some of our biggest clients were in New York and Massachusetts. The charges carried severe, compounding penalties. But the legal system wasn't the only thing tearing Beatrice's life apart. The most vicious blow came from the man who had bankrolled her arrogance. Preston, her investment banker husband, didn't just walk out of the courtroom that day, He walked straight to his own team of ruthless corporate attorneys. Before Beatrice was even processed at the county jail, Preston had enacted a scorched earth protocol. He filed for an emergency divorce, citing a morality clause in their ironclad prenuptial agreement that instantly nullified any spousal support in the event of a felony conviction. Even worse for my sister, Preston froze all their joint accounts, claiming the funds were currently under investigation to ensure they weren't tainted by her criminal conspiracy. When Beatrice was granted a bail hearing 3 days later, she stood in an Orange County jumpsuit, her designer makeup long washed away, looking utterly hollow. She begged the judge to let her call Preston. She was informed that Preston had already filed a restraining order, claiming her erratic, criminal behavior was a threat to his public standing and their estate. Beatrice, who had lived her entire adult life wrapped in cashmere, sipping champagne in Parisian penthouses, couldn't post her own bail. She spent the next 6 months sitting in a stark, concrete cell in the county detention center, waiting for her criminal trial. David Aris, terrified of spending his twilight years behind bars, flipped on her completely. He surrendered the $50,000 in cash she had paid him, handed over text messages proving she had purchased the antique notary stamp online, and detailed exactly how she had practiced forging our mother's signature by tracing old birthday cards. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable evidence, Beatrice's public defender advised her to take a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to 2 counts of felony fraud and 1 count of perjury. Judge Patricia Miller, who absolutely despised having her courtroom used as a theater for criminal deceit, showed no leniency. She sentenced Beatrice to 4 years in a state correctional facility, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. A month after the sentencing, I drove down to the county courthouse. I didn't go to see the judge, and I certainly didn't go to see my sister. I walked up to the security checkpoint and asked for Officer Thomas Gable. He met me in a quiet alcove near the cafeteria, holding a styrofoam cup of black coffee. Out of his formal bailiff uniform, wearing a simple button-down shirt, he looked just like any other tired grandfather. "Miss Harrison," he said, nodding respectfully. "I hope the estate is settling down." "It is," I said, my voice thick with emotion. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small, unassuming envelope. "Officer Gable, my lawyers told me I can't give you money, and I know you wouldn't accept it anyway. But I wanted to give you this." He opened the envelope. Inside was a lifetime transferable voucher for Oakwell Designs, free landscaping, free floral arrangements, free property care, forever, for him and anyone in his immediate family. Gable looked at the card, then up at me, a soft, genuine smile cracking his weathered face. "My wife loves orchids," he murmured. "She's been trying to grow them in our sunroom for years, but she always overwaters them. I'll come set up a custom irrigation drip for her myself," I promised, a tear finally slipping down my cheek. "Officer Gable, why did you look so closely at that paper? You could have just handed it to the judge and gone back to the wall. Why did you care?" He took a slow sip of his coffee, looking out the narrow courthouse window. 30 years ago, when I was a rookie detective, my own brother tried to steal our father's pension using a fake power of attorney. I didn't catch it in time. My dad lost everything, and it broke his heart. When I saw your sister sitting up there, wearing all that expensive jewelry, sneering at you, I recognized the look. It's the look of someone who thinks they are entitled to the harvest because they merely exist, while someone else breaks their back tilling the soil. "I saw the watermark by pure chance, Miss Harrison, but I spoke up because I refused to watch the soil get robbed again." I hugged him. It was completely unprofessional, and he stiffened for a second before gently patting my shoulder, but I didn't care. He hadn't just saved my business, he had saved my sanity. Today, Oakwell Designs is larger than ever. We expanded our greenhouses, bought an adjoining 20 acres of land, and launched a nationwide botanical shipping line. The ancient Victorian house where my mother and father raised us has been fully restored, its foundations reinforced, its woodwork polished to a warm, golden shine. It is no longer a crumbling relic of debt, it is a fortress of life. Sometimes, late at night, I walk through the humid, earth-scented air of the main greenhouse. I run my fingers over the vibrant, blooming petals of the rare orchids I cultivated from seeds. I think about my sister, sitting in a 6 by 8 cell, wearing state-issued cotton, stripped of her wealthy husband, her fake friends, and her stolen legacy. I don't feel guilt. I don't feel triumph. I just feel an overwhelming sense of peace. In the end, Beatrice wanted to rule the kingdom without ever digging her hands into the dirt. She lost her husband, her freedom, and her entire future, permanently trading a life of stolen luxury for a cold concrete cell. I kept Oakwell not because of a forged piece of paper, but because I built it with my own 2 hands. Blood might make you relatives, but loyalty, hard work, and truth are what actually build a legacy.